The 7th of February, 1981, a normal winter morning at Pushkin military airfield near Leningrad. A Tupolev Tuesday 104 of the Soviet Navy rolled into position on the icy runway, its twin engines humming with restrained power. There was nothing unusual about the weather that day. No storm clouds, no enemy aircraft, just a slight crosswind and some light snow dusting the tarmac. A typical northern winter scene. Then, 8 seconds after takeoff, the unthinkable happened. The aircraft plunged back to Earth, slamming into frozen soil just 1,500 meters from the runway. The explosion was immediate, catastrophic. All 50 souls on board were incinerated in a fireball of jet fuel and shattered steel. But this was not just another Soviet air crash. This was an execution, not by an enemy, but by a system. The plane carried the entire upper command of the Soviet Pacific Fleet. In one deafening blast, 16 admirals and generals, including Fleet Commander Admiral Emil Spiridonov, were annihilated. It was the worst command-level loss the Soviet military had ever suffered outside of wartime, and yet almost no one in the outside world even knew it happened. Why were so many senior officers on one aging aircraft? Why was a jetliner, already banned from civilian use, still flying military brass? And what really caused the aircraft to rise, then fall, as if some unseen hand lifted it into the sky, only to let it drop like a stone? This is the story of a crash that never should have happened, and of a country so obsessed with secrecy, it buried its own fleet commanders without ever admitting the truth. The Tuesday 104 that took off from Pushkin airfield that morning had flown many missions before. It was part of the 25th Naval Aviation Division, one of the few military units still operating the aging jetliner after it was withdrawn from civilian service in 1979 due to repeated fatal accidents. But in the military, old aircraft don't retire, they just change uniforms. That week, in early February, high-ranking officers from all over the Soviet Navy had gathered in Leningrad for an annual strategic meeting. It was tradition, it was protocol, it was political theater dressed in medals and red flags. They had reported to Admiral Sergei Gorshkov, the legendary commander of the entire Soviet Navy, about the readiness of their fleets. Of them all, it was the Pacific Fleet that received the highest praise. Admiral Spiridonov, a stern but respected commander, had led his delegation with pride. He and his officers had impressed Gorshkov so much that they received personal commendation. Spirits were high. What followed was the predictable Soviet military ritual: speeches, drinking, handshakes, more drinking, awards, and plans to fly back home, a journey of nearly 7,000 kilometers east to Vladivostok. On the morning of the 7th, they assembled at Pushkin airfield, snow under their boots, medals under their coats. Dozens of admirals, captains, and their staff, some even brought along spouses or favored civilians. Despite regulations, they were in a good mood, a euphoric one. Perhaps the meeting had gone well. Leningrad had good shopping, and they were eager to get back to the far eastern bases they commanded. Eyewitnesses recalled nothing unusual at first. Then, the aircraft began its takeoff run. It seemed a bit slow, perhaps sluggish, but the aircraft lifted into the air nonetheless. What happened next, however, burned itself into the memory of every person watching from the tarmac. The Tuesday 104 did not ascend smoothly. It pitched upward, unnaturally, hung in the sky like a suspended cross, then rolled nose up, engine straining, and smashed into the earth with a thunderclap. A towering orange fireball rose where the aircraft had been just seconds earlier. The shock wave shook the windows of the nearby airfield buildings. Those in the departure zone rushed toward the crash site. slogging through deep snowdrifts, but it was too late. The fire from 30 tons of jet fuel was too intense. The wreckage was a furnace. Bodies were gone before anyone could reach them. Only one crew member was found, thrown through the nose cockpit. He died en route to the hospital. All 50 on board were killed. Among them, 16 admirals and generals, 12 colonels and captains, and several civilians. In just 8 seconds, the Soviet Pacific Fleet lost its brain, and the Soviet Navy was thrown into a chaos that no Cold War strategist had ever prepared for. The aftermath was surreal. To lose 16 senior officers in one accident was a blow of unimaginable scale. To the Soviet High Command, it felt like a decapitation, sudden, brutal, and possibly deliberate. In Moscow, fear turned quickly into paranoia. Could this be sabotage? An enemy plot? Was the West somehow behind it, perhaps even the CIA? High-level alerts were issued across the Soviet Far East. The Pacific Fleet braced for a possible attack. Air defenses were scrambled. Patrols intensified. Commanders prepared fallback scenarios. But no enemy came. Hours passed. Days passed. And gradually, a greater fear crept in. The fear that the problem wasn't outside the fence, but inside. Soviet authorities turned their suspicions inward. If the crash wasn't caused by enemy action, then perhaps someone inside the Navy had orchestrated it. There was one man who immediately drew attention: Vice Admiral Rudolf Golosov, Chief of Staff of the Pacific Fleet. He was supposed to be on that plane, but he wasn't. At the last minute, Golosov had declined the flight, asking Admiral Spiridonov for permission to visit his daughter in Murmansk. The request had been approved just hours before takeoff. To the KGB and counterintelligence, that was suspicious. Too convenient. Could Golosov have arranged the crash to eliminate his superior and assume command? But as investigations unfolded, it became clear that Golosov's absence was legitimate. His request had been documented. His flight to Murmansk logged. As he would later recount in his memoir, it was during the long drive north to see his daughter that a police car caught up with him. He was ordered to return immediately. On the phone with Admiral Gorshkov, Golosov learned the truth. His entire command had been obliterated. He was shocked, silent, disbelieving. Then, privately, his friend in military counterintelligence told him, "You were considered a suspect. But if there was no sabotage and no enemy plot, what then? What could bring down an aircraft with a veteran crew, good weather, and no signs of distress just moments after takeoff?" That's when investigators turned to the Tupolev Tuesday 104 itself. And what they found in the black box data was more damning than any foreign conspiracy. The Tuesday 104 was a marvel when it was introduced in the 1950s. It was the Soviet Union's first jet airliner, a direct symbol of technological equality with the West, but it had been rushed into production. Its design was based on the Tuesday 16 bomber, and it flew like one, difficult to handle, heavy on controls, prone to sudden pitch and roll, and, most dangerously, extremely sensitive to how weight was distributed within the fuselage. By the 1970s, its civilian variant had developed a notorious safety record, so bad, in fact, that it was removed from commercial use in 1979 after a series of fatal crashes. But the military, as it so often does, kept flying it. They had little choice. Aircraft production in the USSR was plagued by delays and politics. The Navy's high command still flew on these aging jets, retrofitted only slightly since the Khrushchev era. The captain of the doomed flight, Lt. Colonel Anatoly Ilyushin, was no novice. He had over 8,000 hours of flight experience, 6,000 of them on the Tuesday 104. He knew the aircraft's quirks, its dangers, its temperament. So why did he take off at 185 kilometers per hour when regulations required at least 220? Why was the aircraft's angle of attack so steep, nearly double what was normal? And why, according to black box data, was there no control pressure recorded on the yoke at the moment of takeoff? In other words, the aircraft lifted off by itself. If the pilots didn't raise the nose, what did? The answer lay not in the sky, but in the cargo hold. To understand what really happened, we need to go beyond instruments and airspeeds. We need to look inside the Soviet military culture itself, where rank was power, and power meant privilege. According to General Viktor Sokrin, a senior aviation officer who investigated the crash, the loading process that day was utter chaos. The plane was not just carrying people, it was carrying groceries. No, not food for the fleet, groceries for admirals, furniture, refrigerators, china sets, even a personal car part. The rear axle of a Moskvich, destined for Admiral Spiridonov's private vehicle. Ilyushin had previously complained about this abuse, filing a report to the political department of the Navy. He stated that his flights were routinely overloaded with personal cargo for officers, but no one dared challenge an admiral. Not in the Soviet Union. According to eyewitnesses, the admiral's staff physically argued with the flight crew. Co-pilots were insulted, threatened, even verbally retired mid-loading. The aircrew were treated as mere chauffeurs, not professionals with authority over flight safety. And most dangerously, the cargo was loaded unevenly. Much of it, including 2 massive rolls of printing paper weighing half a ton, each was stowed toward the rear. In flight dynamics, this is fatal. The center of gravity shifted too far back. It was enough to pitch the aircraft's nose upward by itself even before proper takeoff speed was reached. Once the angle exceeded a safe threshold, the wing lost lift. The Tuesday 104 stalled, and then it fell. In the end, the flight crew never had a chance. They were flying a bomb, not an airplane. And it was lit the moment the generals decided they were above the rules of flight, physics, and mortality. What happens to a nation that loses an entire chain of command and chooses to pretend it never did? For most of the world, the tragedy at Pushkin never existed. The Soviet Union, expert in hiding its own wounds, ensured that the crash was immediately classified. A brief, impersonal note appeared in Krasnaya Zvezda, the Red Star military newspaper, on page 3. It stated, in code language, that a group of Navy officers of the Pacific Fleet perished in an air accident. No explanation. 3 names. No funerals were televised. No state mourning declared. And then, silence. The families of the victims, widows of admirals, children of captains received no formal confirmation of their loved ones' deaths until 1997. 16 years later, and 6 years after the fall of the Soviet Union itself, only then did a small memorial stone appear in Leningrad. At the burial site of the victims, it read, "To the Navy servicemen of the Pacific Fleet, who died serving on duty on the 7th of February, 1981. Later, one bitter addition was made, who died serving on duty, but not who died while flying a cargo hold full of chandeliers, oranges, and armchairs." Because admitting that would mean confronting a deeper truth, that this was not a tragedy of fate, but of systemic rot. The psychological toll on survivors like Admiral Golosov was immense. He never flew on the Tuesday 104 again. He would recount later that his name was almost engraved on that memorial stone. But what truly haunted him, more than the suspicion or the grief, was the system that had made it all possible. This was not a singular failure. This was a pattern. 14 years later, in 1996, another military aircraft in Antonov, and 12 crashed, while carrying 17 passengers, including General Sergei Seleznyov, commander of the Leningrad Military District. The cause: the aircraft was overloaded with construction supplies for the general's private house, including bricks, beams, and his personal car. History had repeated itself, and again. The Soviet, now Russian military remained silent. One might argue, this isn't about aircraft, it's about arrogance, about what happens when hierarchy becomes untouchable, when power is no longer checked, even by physics. What kind of military allows its own top brass to violate basic safety norms not in war, but in peace? The Tuesday 104 crash at Pushkin wasn't just the end of an aircraft model. It was the unspoken eulogy of a command culture driven not by discipline, but entitlement. The Tupolev itself, a technical marvel twisted by politics, continued serving in some military roles even after the disaster. But never again did it carry an entire naval fleet's leadership on a single flight, because there was no longer a fleet leadership to carry. The Pacific Fleet was reorganized, its command structure rebuilt piece by piece. But the scars ran deeper than empty offices. They ran through confidence, through morale, through a growing awareness that even admirals, for all their medals and might, were not safe from the consequences of their own hubris. And yet, the lesson was never fully absorbed, because no one was allowed to speak it out loud. In his memoir, Admiral Golosov described the scene that still haunted him most. As officers raced toward the wreckage that day, flames still roaring from twisted metal. They could see oranges rolling across the snow, untouched, whole, perfect, the last remnants of the admiral's shopping spree, bright, citrus-colored ghost tumbling from a burning field of wreckage. Not a single body could be recovered intact. But the oranges survived. In a way, they became a metaphor for the absurdity, for the blindness, for a military machine that prized appearances over procedures and goods over governance. You see, empires don't fall from war alone. They fall when no one is allowed to ask why the plane is too heavy, when no one can tell the admiral no, when the brightest minds are incinerated not in battle, but by bureaucracy. The crash at Pushkin did not begin with an aircraft. It began with a culture, and that culture never crashed. It simply adjusted course. So the next time someone tells you that the Soviet military was invincible, that it was a colossus of order and power, remember the oranges rolling, glowing, almost mocking in the snow. The silence of the state could not erase them. And the truth, like fire, always leaves a smell long after the smoke has cleared.